Today I'm going to be talking about the prayers regarding the demographics of our church. We know that God wants to have every tribe, every tongue, and every nation coming together in unity to worship Him. And in order to do that, we need to be churches that reflect the demographics of our town. And so for Pac Portage, that means that we need to be a church comprised of 1/3 First Nations. And in Pac Nipawa, hello Nipawa, by the way, we need to be a church that is comprised of 1/3 Filipino people. Now, you'll remember when Nathan talked about this before, he gave us some imagery that went along with our prayer for demographics. And he said that when heaven comes to earth, it's going to be like this big parade with every tribe and every tongue and every nation worshiping God together in unity. And he said, you are going to hear the big bass tones of the powwow drum leading the way. I loved that imagery. Thanks so much, Chris. But I want to give you some more imagery today. I want to say that these 4 prayers that God has invited us into are like a party. So get that image of a party. You're invited to a party with these 4 prayers. But it's unlike most parties, because lots of people are invited to this party, but few actually attend. It reminds me of a time when I was in my early 20s and I tried to throw a party. Similar to what just happened with the mics there. But I had just bought my first house. And I was so excited about it. I was telling all my friends at work about it. And they said to me, you know what, Tamara? We need to see it. We're all going to come to your house on Monday for supper. So I said, sure, let's do that. Sounds like a great plan. And this was on Friday. So I went home on Friday and I just scrubbed my house from top to bottom, made it completely clean. I went out and bought groceries. And even though it was like, I think July, I bought groceries for a Christmas feast. And I prepped all weekend. Then I went back to work on Monday, went up to my friends and said, so you're coming for dinner, right? And they all laughed and said, Tamara, we were just joking. And I was like, oh, I knew that. And I walked away so hurt and embarrassed and wondering, how did I get that so wrong? And it's very similar to the party Jesus is describing in Matthew 22. This is a parable, and he's speaking to the teachers of religious law, the Pharisees, and the Jewish people. He's trying to describe what the kingdom of heaven will be like. He says, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by a story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. Many guests were invited, and when the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify everyone that it was time to come. But they all refused. So he sent other servants to tell them, the feast has been prepared, and choice meats have been cooked. Everything is ready, hurry. But the guests he had invited ignored them and went about their business, one to his farm, another to his store. Others seized his messengers and treated them shamefully, even killing some of them. So I just want to explain what's going on here and what the Jewish people would have understood as happening. In those days, to be invited to a king's house for dinner was a huge honor. Just like in today, if you got invited to the king's house, you would be considered a big honor to be invited. What the king did is he would send out the invites well in advance. And you would clear your calendar on that day, so the whole day was reserved for this party. Now, a second set of invites would be sent out the day of. And that was because they didn't know how long it would take to prep for this party. So when everything was done, they'd send out a second invite, and that's where Jesus is picking up. The second invite has gone out. To refuse such an invitation was a huge insult. Bigger than we can imagine. It was actually considered treasonous. And so what Jesus is saying to the Jewish people here is he's saying, God has tried to reveal his heart to you by throwing a party for his son. And his son has taught you so much about what is near and dear to his heart. And he's invited you to this party that God's throwing. But you have refused. And you have said, I don't like your son, and I don't want anything to do with your party. And so God, in his graciousness, has invited them again. He sends out a second set of servants and says, come to my party, see how good it is. There's choice meats, there's a huge feast. Come to my party. Don't you see, life over here is better than life over there. And the Jewish people have said, I've got other priorities. I've got my store, I've got my farm. I want nothing to do with you. You get my leftovers. And if you send those servants to me, I'm going to kill them. And that's what they did. See, God was inviting the Jewish people to a party, but what they had to do in order to attend this party was they had to change their thinking to be in line with what Jesus had been teaching them. They had to do something that was called repent, which means to change your thinking and change your actions so they come in line with God's thinking and God's actions. They come in line with what's near and dear to his heart. But the Jewish people weren't interested in doing that. So let's continue on. In verse 7, it says, then the king became furious. He sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their city. And he said to the servants, the wedding feast is ready, and the guests I have invited aren't worthy of the honor. Now, Jesus is speaking prophetically here about what's going to happen to Jerusalem in the future. And the Romans are going to come and burn Jerusalem to the ground. Were the Roman soldiers Jesus' chosen army to deliver his justice? No. But the Jewish people had said, no, we want nothing to do with you. We don't want to change our thinking. And they rejected God, and he gave them the free will to do that. So he went somewhere else, and he left them to their own priorities, to what they worshipped. And that's when Rome swept in. And so let's continue on here. Jesus said, the king said to the servants, now go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see. So the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike. And the banquet hall was filled with the guests. What Jesus is saying here to the Jews is God's going to invite other people to his party. And there's going to be people there that you probably don't like the prostitutes, like the tax collectors, like the Gentiles. And they are going to be invited to this party instead. But when the king came to meet the guests, he noticed a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. Friend, he asked, how is it that you are here without wedding clothes? And the man had no reply. Then the king said to his aides, bind him hand and foot and throw him out into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, many are invited to this party, but few are chosen. What Jesus is saying there, and what the Jews would have understood, is that in those days, when you were invited to the king's party, it was an honor. And so wearing proper clothing meant you wore something that wasn't soiled. You would take the time to wash your clothing. And if the king wanted certain clothes to be worn, he would provide them at the door. So I don't know what's happening here, whether the man wore dirty clothes to the king's party, or whether he just refused to wear the clothing offered to him. But it's like saying another insult to the king. It's like saying, I don't like anything you're doing. In fact, I have utter contempt for you. And so I'm going to wear these clothes that aren't reflective of this party, because I'm here, but I'm not participating. And when we choose to go against God's thinking like that, we end up in our own sort of hell. So when you read this parable in commentaries, it often talks about what it would have meant for the people of that day, what it meant for the Jews of that day, and then what it means for the church of today. And what I want to say about this parable for us at PAC is that God has invited us to a party with these 4 prayers. But in order to attend this party, we need to change our thinking. As we have gone through this series, many of us have found we have had to change our thinking on an award-winning town. How can that possibly be spiritual, is what some of us have said. We've had to change our thinking on multi-site. Many of us have had to change our thinking on healing. And now today I want to dive into how do we change our thinking on demographics? How do we change our thinking so it lines up with God's, so that we become a church here at PAC Portage that is 1/3 First Nations, and we become a church in Nipawa that is 1/3 Filipino? Well, in order to do that, we have to look at where our thinking doesn't line up with God's. So I'm going to give a few examples. And then after that, we're going to look at a second question, if we're clothed right for this party that God has invited us to. But first, let's analyze our thinking. What about our thinking makes our churches unattractive to other people? What about it makes it not feel welcomed? We really got to dive into that and look at that. If you listen to the news nowadays, immigrants are being blamed for a lot of things. Right? We're building a wall, they're stealing our houses, they're stealing our jobs, and crime rates going up, and the blame goes on and on. You don't have to listen to the news very long. And if you accept that, your thinking changes. And you have thoughts about a group of people that are very different from what God's thoughts are about them. I know a few years ago I was in Nipawa, and I was talking with someone about the recent population explosion and how it was so great that there were so many Filipino people coming to Nipawa. And the person looked at me with anger, and they said, they keep to themselves. And I was like, why are we angry about this? I don't really understand, because no kidding. They've moved to a new country. They've moved and they've had to figure out new policies, new rules, new way of life. They've left their friends and family, new language, and to top it all off, sometimes they have to deal with -40 winters. No kidding, that some of those news would create some fears, right? But God has positioned us to be the welcoming agents for these people. He has said, show them my love. Fill in the gaps when their family is missing. So we need to wrap our heads around where our thinking isn't in line with God's. Regarding First Nations people, I realized that God was changing my thinking long before I ever heard about this prayer. It started when I was in university, and someone pointed out to me that one of my longtime friends, like I went to elementary school, went to high school, played ball with this girl. She was in my inner circle of friends, and they told me she's a First Nations girl, which was shocking to me. You think I would have picked that up earlier, but it took me till I was in university to figure that out. But what was really shocking to me was how it stopped me in my tracks, because I didn't think that I was the kind of person who was going to have a First Nations friend. Because in my mind, First Nations people were over here, and I was over here, and I often looked down my nose at them. And I realized that those thoughts were going on in my head. And I realized that I didn't want them there, and that God had to do a work in my life to get rid of them. And so then God brought me to a new job in BC where I met some people who had a different approach And they were friends with First Nations people. They honored them. They loved them. They did life together, and I admired it. And I wanted that for myself. So my thinking continued to change. And then God brought me back to Winnipeg. My thinking, I realized, still needed to change because this mandate came down from management in my new job in Winnipeg that said everyone had to take Aboriginal culture and sensitivity training. And the people who I was working with were grumbling about it and didn't want to do it. I was one of those people who was grumbling about it and didn't want to do it. I remember even saying, I've already handed in my notice. I'm going to work at a church in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, as if I'll ever need Aboriginal culture and sensitivity training. Thank goodness God had other plans for me, because I was like the Jews who were saying, I have other priorities. But God said, no, I'm inviting you to this party. So I went to the training, and I heard about the beauty of the Aboriginal culture. And my mind and the negative thoughts that I had towards a group of people was shifting and began to change. And I could see the error in my thoughts. But I also heard about the horrors of what has happened to Aboriginal people in Canada. This one man who was in his late 50s or early 60s, he talked to us about his experience in the residential schools. And he said night after night after night, as a young boy in the school, he was repeatedly raped. It was heart-wrenching to listen to that story, and embarrassing that it happened in a country that I love. But what was more heartbreaking was the next day when I went back to work, and one of my coworkers came up to me, and she was referring specifically to his story. And she said to me, "Don't tell me your crap sob story." And something in me broke that day, and I thought, I never want to be like that woman. And God, this fast-tracking, thought-changing process you've put me on, you need to increase the speed, because I don't want to think like her, and I don't want to be like her. I don't want to see a person before me made in God's image and not recognize them as worthy of love and worthy of compassion. And I don't want to be a person who can't see the pain right before my eyes. So God, change me, is where I went with that. Because you know these thoughts that you have that aren't in line with God's, they aren't neutral. They breed anger. They breed bitterness. They breed contempt. They breed judgment. And they push you down and oppress you. And as they take you and squash you into the ground, you take others with you, because an oppressed person oppresses others. And that is our Canadian history. And I'm saying, I don't want to be that way anymore. God, change my thinking, because I want to be a part of the party that you have invited me to. And part of changing our thinking is realizing, are we dressed appropriately for this party? Do we have the right clothes on? I want to go to a place in the Bible that talks about having the right clothes. There are many places that talk about what we as Christ followers need to be wearing. But I want to focus on Colossians 3. Because in Colossians 3, it talks about the racial issues of that day before it goes into what clothing we need to wear. So let's go to verse 11. It says, in this new life, in this party that we've been invited to, it doesn't matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile. It doesn't matter if you are First Nations, white, or Filipino. Doesn't matter if you are circumcised, uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Doesn't matter if you speak English or not. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us. And since God chose you to be the holy people whom he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. You must make allowance for each other's faults and forgive the person who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. And the most important piece of clothing you must wear is love. Love is what binds us all together in perfect harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are all called to live in peace and always be thankful. So when we see a new immigrant to Canada, do we respond with tender-hearted mercy? Do we get to know their story? Do we feel compassion for them? Do we have patience for them? You know, if you've ever gone through the painful process of moving somewhere, you know that person who extends a hand and welcomes you in, who says, here's how things work in Canada. Hey, why don't you come over to my house for Thanksgiving? Because it's a bit different than the rest of the world, but I'd love for you to share a meal with me. You know that the person who extends that to you is like a lifeline, because it's a scary thing. I have an aunt who is a nurse, or she was a nurse, in Morris, Manitoba. And in Morris, they had quite an influx of Filipino nurses who had immigrated and started working with her in the hospital. And I was so impressed by her compassion for this group of people. She would often tell us about their stories. Oh, there's one nurse I work with, and she's had to leave her baby and her husband back in the Philippines, and she's raising money, trying to get enough so that they can come and live in Canada with her. And there's another nurse who sends most of her paycheck back home so her parents can survive in the Philippines. And she said, I get to welcome them into my house. I get to have them over for dinner. She already knew their story, but she stood in the gap and was a pseudo-family when their family was all back in the Philippines. And Nipua, God has positioned you to be this for the Filipino people, to be the welcoming agents, to invite them into your home, to say, no, I'm not going to listen to what the media says, but to be loving, tender-hearted, merciful, and patient. And Pack, Portage, I'm wondering if we've ever clothed ourselves in humility. Have we ever listened to the First Nations story of their culture and tried to learn from it? Because that's going to change things and change our perspective and change our thinking. I know when I went to the Aboriginal culture and sensitivity training, like I said, there was a few people who didn't want to be there, and this one lady was particularly antagonistic. And she raised her hand in the middle of the session, and she said, why are you people always late? And this teacher, who was so kind, said to her, we have different perspectives on time. That minute hand controls you, and you jump from place to place and busyness to busyness. But I see the person in front of me, and I will not leave that person until they've said everything they've needed to say, and I've said everything I needed to say. Until they felt seen, until they felt honored, until they felt loved. And when all that has happened, then I move on. But I don't do it before. So in my mind, I'm never late, he said. But I also never leave anything undone. Does that sound like a kingdom perspective that maybe we could learn from in humility? And I know there are white people out there who would say, but I'm just trying to honor the person waiting for me. And the First Nations person is saying, I'm trying to honor the person right in front of me. What if these two groups of people got together? Would we see maybe a little bit of heaven on earth as we exchanged ideas? Who has ever gone to an appointment and has felt like they were brushed off as the person ran away to where the second hand was taking them to? Maybe we could learn something in humility from the First Nations culture and bring it to Portage La Prairie. And maybe that would create an award-winning town, as everyone felt seen, everyone felt honored, and everyone felt loved. I have this friend that God has blessed me with who is a First Nations woman. And she has made allowances for me when I have asked her questions, when I've said politically incorrect things, when just out of ignorance I don't know. And one day I was trying to learn more about powwow with her. And I said, so Joan, these costumes you wear. And she said, no, Tamara, they're not costumes. Very patiently. She said, the clothing we wear at the powwow is called regalia. And I thought, of course it is. Because it's an identity item you are putting on, and you are kings and queens. And until I start seeing you as kings and queens, as the kingdom identity that God has given you, until I see you that way, nothing will change. But when I start and recognizing you as kings and queens, as princes and princesses, as people so valuable, my brothers and sisters who God adores and loves, when I start seeing you that way, then the kingdom has come and the party has started. And then do we ever throw out love? It tells us to clothe ourselves in love. Do we ever throw out love without expecting anything back? And when anger is returned, we just keep throwing out love. Have you ever done that for anyone who is maybe a bit different than you? There's this girl who I meet with during the school year for lunch every week, her and her friends, and she's First Nations. And I'm trying to get to know her, but she is a woman of few words, so it's pretty hard. But I chat with her, and I do most of the chatting, and every once in a while she'll give me a grunt or a yes or a roll her eyes at me. But I keep trying to get to know her. And we were walking down the halls of the school one day, and I was finished talking, so I did what I normally do to people. I just gave her a pat on her the back of her shoulder. And that's my way of saying, I love you, have a good day. But she retracted from me with such anger. And I thought, okay, mental note, I've got to build up some trust with this kid. So I kept chatting. I kept trying to pour out love over her. And every once in a while I'd forget, and I'd do the pat thing on her shoulder, and I'd be like, oh, I need to remember she doesn't like that. And then one day I see her walking down the halls again, and the tears are right brimming in her eyes. And her little cheeks are so red, and I can tell she's trying to hold back the floodgate of tears that are right below the surface. So I ask her what's wrong, and she doesn't want to talk about it. So I say, can I pray for you? And I could tell that this was an uncomfortable thing for her, but she allowed me to. And I prayed for God's peace and for his love to fill her. I don't know if anything changed in that moment, but we continued to get together. We continued to learn more about each other. And then one day I'm walking down the hall, I'm finished talking, and I go pat on her shoulder, and I think, oh, you did it again. But all of a sudden I feel a pat on the back of my shoulder. And I'm like, I've got a little bit of trust there. And so we keep getting together. Her and her family come over to my house for Christmas dinner, and we're just involved in important events in their life as we get to know them more. keep talking to her. And then one day there is this crisis that happens in her family. And her family isn't like my family. Her kids, or she doesn't have kids. She does not have parents like my kids have parents. And this crisis that happened was threatening all that she did have. So I went up to her and I said, I'm so sorry for what's going on in your life. And I give her a Plan to Protect approved side hug. And all of a sudden I feel her little arm go across my back and her other arm go across my front, and she's kind of clinging to me in this weird sort of side hug like that. And then I became the awkward one because I didn't know what to do. This was new for us. And so I sort of hugged her back, and I thought in that moment, this is probably the first time in 4 years this kid has been hugged because her mom died 4 years ago. And I was able to stand in the gap and be a family to someone who had no family. And I felt like I went from being invited to the party to chosen in that moment. And that is a party that I will attend day after day after day. I want to be involved in loving all these people that God has put in front of us. So when people say immigration is never going to work, you are never going to get rid of racism. When they say reconciliation can't happen, I say those are just mountains that need to be flattened. Mountains of lies that need to be flattened. Because in saying that, you are saying that Jesus or God can't set the table to his own banquet that he has invited me to. And I want to be in that party. I want to be the person throwing out tender-hearted mercy and love and compassion. I want to be the person who stands up and says, no more to oppression and to the things that would grind us into the ground. I want to see people as the kings and queens they are, as so very precious, precious like diamonds. That's what I want to see. And I want to build people up rather than tear them down. And you may say that you are fighting against something that the Canadian government can never figure out. And I will say, of course, because they don't have the power to figure this out. Not that I don't like our government officials, I do, but they don't have the power to figure it out. But right here within this room, every single one of us has the power to figure this out. As we step out with tender-hearted mercy, as we clothe ourselves with love, the power to figure this out is right inside every single one of us. So when someone comes up to me and says, there is no hope for First Nations communities, my response is, get behind me, Satan, because I have a party to go to. Right now, we are going to have the band come and play a song for us. And it just reminds me of what we are called into. Learning from First Nations people, accepting new people to Canada. We are called to be not just invited to this party, but the chosen ones. Take a listen to this song.